He expected a black-edged letter informing him of her quiet, dignified demise. He had, after all, purchased a sickly bride and banished her to a rotting estate on the edge of nowhere, a place as much a tomb as a house. He did not expect, upon his own exhausted return seeking that very same silence, to find the tomb resurrected, breathing smoke and warmth. He did not expect to find the dying bride not only alive but thriving, a queen of mud and ledgers. And he certainly did not expect that by the time the first snows fell, he, the Duke of Blackwood, would find himself in exile at the servants' table in his own home, utterly unable to imagine a future without the woman he had sent there to die. The solicitor's office smelled of dust and dying hopes. Rain, the color of weak tea, streaked the tall windows, blurring the grim procession of London life outside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, sealing wax, and the quiet desperation of men who dealt in the legalities of ruin. Duke Alastair Valerius, Lord of Blackwood, and a dozen other, grander titles, stood by the window, his back to the room. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, all sharp angles and imposing height, his presence sucking the very air from the cramped space. He was not looking at the rain-slicked street. He was looking at his own reflection, a dark, indistinct shape against the gray light, and finding it as hollow as he felt. This entire affair was a distasteful necessity, another line item in the ledger of his obligations, no different from settling a tenant dispute or purchasing a new string of horses. It was simply a matter of greater permanence and infinitely greater inconvenience. Across the room, seated in a worn horsehair chair that seemed determined to shed its stuffing, Elara sat. She was a study in pale colors. Pale skin, pale dress of mended gray wool, pale lips pressed into a line of grim endurance. The only vibrant thing about her was the feverish light in her large, lucid eyes and the faint, almost invisible tremor in her hands, which she kept tightly clasped in her lap. A cough, dry and persistent, rattled in her chest, a tiny, infuriating betrayal of the composure she fought so hard to maintain. She had been trying to suppress it for the better part of an hour, each stifled hack a small defeat. Beside her, her uncle, Mr. Gideon Brown, fidgeted. He was a man whose ambition had always outpaced his ability, leaving him perpetually adrift in a sea of debt and bad decisions. His suit was shiny at the elbows, his face flushed with a combination of cheap gin and frantic hope. He saw the Duke not as a man, but as a lifeline, a port in the storm of his own making. He saw his niece, Elara, not as a person, but as the currency for his salvation. He had paraded her supposed virtues, her quiet nature, her gentle breeding, her unfortunate but manageable ill health, as if he were a horse trader showing off a filly with a slight limp that could surely be overlooked for the right price. "The girl is delicate, as we have discussed," Gideon Brown said, his voice slick with a sycophantic oiliness that made Alastair's teeth ache. "But of good stock, a companionable nature. She will not be a burden, your grace. She understands her position." Alastair turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over them with an unnerving lack of interest. It lingered for a moment on Elara, taking in the worn dress, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders were hunched as if expecting a blow. He noted the cough she tried to disguise as clearing her throat. Sickly, bankrupt, an orphan. She was the perfect solution to a very particular problem. He needed a wife, a duchess, to satisfy the terms of a distant relative's will that tied a significant portion of his unentailed lands to his marital status. He did not need a partner. He did not need a lover. He needed a name on a piece of paper, a body in a house, a woman who would be too weak, too grateful, and too isolated to interfere with his life. This pale, coughing creature seemed purpose-built for the role. Her position, Alastair repeated, the words flat and cold. Her position is to be my wife, to reside where I see fit, to not trouble me with correspondence, requests, or her presence. In return, your debts are cleared, Mr. Brown. You will receive a modest annuity, sufficient to keep you from the gutter, provided you never, under any circumstances, attempt to contact my wife or myself again. Are these terms understood? Gideon Brown practically vibrated with eagerness. Perfectly, Your Grace. Absolutely perfectly. You are too generous. Alistair's lip curled in a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. He was not generous. He was efficient. He was purchasing silence and solitude, and the price was a pittance. His gaze fell on Alara again. And you? You understand what is being asked of you. For the first time, Alara looked directly at him. Her eyes, he noticed with a detached sort of surprise, were not the washed-out gray he had expected, but a deep, clear green, like moss after a rain. They held no fear, no pleading, only a profound, unnerving stillness. I understand that I am being sold, she said, her voice quiet but clear, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice. The sound cut through the cloying atmosphere of the room. I am to be a ghost in a house of your choosing, in exchange for my uncle's solvency. I believe I have grasped the essential details of the transaction. The solicitor, a desiccated man named Finchley, coughed nervously into his fist. Gideon Brown's face went from flushed to crimson. He opened his mouth to chastise her, to apologize, but Alistair held up a hand, a gesture of absolute authority that silenced the room. He was against all odds intrigued. He had expected tears or vapid gratitude. He had not expected cynical, brutal honesty. It was refreshing. It changed nothing, of course, but it was a flicker of an interesting color in a crushingly gray day. Good, Alistair said. He walked to the desk and picked up a quill, its feather dyed a severe black. Then there is no need for further discussion. He signed the marriage contract with a few swift, angry strokes of the pen. His signature was a jagged, illegible slash of ink, the mark of a man who had more important things to do. He did not offer the quill to Alara. He simply pushed the document across the desk. Her uncle nudged her, a sharp, insistent prod in her ribs. Alara rose, her movements stiff. She walked to the desk, took the quill, and dipped it into the inkpot. Her own signature, in contrast to his, was a model of delicate precision. Alara Vance, the name of a person who was about to cease to exist. She pushed the document back. She did not look at him. She looked at the rain on the window pane, her expression unreadable. And just like that, it was done. She was Duchess of Blackwood. A title as hollow as the cough that now escaped her, a dry, rattling sound in the sudden, oppressive silence of the room. The transaction was complete. The journey north was a study in miserable silence. The ducal carriage was a magnificent thing of black lacquer and perfectly sprung leather, but its opulence only served to highlight the chilling void between its two passengers. For 2 days, they traveled, stopping only at the finest inns where the Duke was met with bows and scrapes, and she, his new Duchess, was met with curious, pitying stares. She was a ghost at his side, a pale wraith in a borrowed traveling cloak. Alistair did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He spent the entire journey immersed in a stack of government dispatches, his brow furrowed, his mind clearly 1,000 miles away in the world of politics and power, a world where she had no place. Alara sat opposite him, her back ramrod straight, and watched the world dissolve. The manicured fields of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to stark, wind-swept moorland. The sky grew heavier, the color of slate, and a persistent, fine drizzle began to fall, clinging to the windows like a shroud. The landscape became a reflection of her own internal state, desolate, empty, and bracing for a long winter. The air in the carriage grew colder, thick with the unsaid. It smelled of damp wool, old leather, and his complete and utter indifference. He was a mountain, an immovable, unfeeling mass of duty and disdain. She was a stone at its base, about to be covered by the scree. She had thought she understood loneliness. She had been an orphan, a poor relation, a companion. She had lived her life on the fringes, in the shadowed corners of other people's homes. But this was a new, more profound isolation. It was the loneliness of being utterly and completely irrelevant. She was not a person to him. She was cargo. A problem solved, a box ticked. Her presence was an administrative detail he was now in the process of filing away. On the evening of the second day, the carriage turned off the main post road and onto a rutted, ill-maintained track. The smooth ride became a jarring, bone-rattling ordeal. Gnarled, skeletal trees clawed at the carriage windows. The world outside was a morass of mud and mist. Finally, through the gloom, a shape emerged. A house. It was not a grand ducal seat. There were no sweeping drives, no stately columns. Blackwood Manor rose from the moor like a rotting tooth. It was a grim, Jacobean pile of dark stone, stained black with age and damp. Gables were missing tiles, half the windows were boarded over, and the gardens were a tangled, chaotic mess of weeds and thorns that seemed to be actively trying to reclaim the house for the wilderness. A single, bent chimney pot issued a thin, miserable plume of gray smoke. It was not a home. It was a tomb. The carriage lurched to a halt in a courtyard of sucking mud. The coachman, a man as grim and silent as his master, opened the door. The air that rushed in was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay. Alistair finally put aside his papers. He did not look at her. He stepped out of the carriage, his immaculate boots sinking into the mire. He did not offer her a hand. He did not wait for her. Alara gathered the worn folds of her cloak and descended, her own thin shoes instantly soaked through with icy water. The rain plastered her hair to her face. She stood, a small, solitary figure in the vast, intimidating shadow of the house, and waited. Alistair gestured vaguely toward the forbidding black door. "This is Blackwood," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a statement of fact, not an introduction. "It will suffice." The front door creaked open, revealing a woman who seemed as much a part of the house as the stones themselves. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. This, Alara guessed, must be the housekeeper. Her expression was one of open, immediate contempt. Alistair addressed the woman, not Alara. "Mrs. Croft, this is your new mistress. See, she is settled." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Settled like dust. He turned back to Alara. For a moment, his eyes met hers, and she saw in them not malice, not even anger, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was as much a prisoner of his life as she was of hers. But his prison had windows that looked out onto the entire world. Hers was this crumbling box. "Do not write to me," he said, the words stark and brutal. "Do not expect anything from me. Stay here and be quiet." It was the most direct and honest communication he had offered her. It was a command to disappear, a dismissal of her entire existence. He was not just leaving her here. He was burying her. He did not wait for a reply. He did not look back. He turned, strode to the carriage, and climbed inside, shutting the door with a solid, final thud. The coachman cracked his whip, and the magnificent carriage, a symbol of a world to which she no longer belonged, churned through the mud and vanished back into the mist and the rain. Alara was left alone in the courtyard, the cold rain seeping into her bones. She stood facing the hostile house, the hostile housekeeper in the doorway, and the vast, empty expanse of the moor behind her. She had been abandoned. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed on her feet. The cough that had been her quiet companion for months suddenly erupted, a raw, racking spasm that bent her double and left her gasping for breath in the cold, damp air. She was sick, she was alone, and she had just been delivered to her grave. The room they gave her was a perfect, miniature replica of the house's soul, cold, damp, and actively hostile to life. It was in the north wing, a narrow, coffin-shaped chamber with a single window that looked out onto a dripping stone wall. A pathetic fire sputtered in the grate, producing more smoke than heat. The air was a symphony of miserable smells, mildew, cold ash, and the faint, cloying scent of decay that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The bed was a vast, canopied monstrosity, its hangings heavy with dust and damp, the sheets themselves feeling clammy and cold to the touch. For days, Ilara lay in that bed, a prisoner of the sheets and her own failing body. The journey, the cold, the final, brutal act of her abandonment had conspired to shatter her fragile health. The cough deepened, settling in her lungs like a malevolent guest. Fever came and went, leaving her weak and shivering. She drifted in a gray twilight of sickness and despair. Section. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, managed the house and its new mistress with the same grim efficiency. She was a creature of the old order, loyal to the memory of the Duke's late mother, a woman who had apparently despised Blackwood and had not set foot in it for 30 years. To Mrs. Croft, Ilara was not a duchess. She was an interloper, a low-born inconvenience, a problem her master had deposited on the doorstep and which she, Mrs. Croft, was expected to manage. And the most efficient way to manage this problem, her every action suggested, was for it to simply cease. A young, terrified maid named Tilly was assigned to her. She would scurry in and out, leaving trays of cold, greasy broth and weak tea on a bedside table just out of reach. She never met Ilara's eye. She was clearly acting under Mrs. Croft's orders. Provide the bare minimum of care required to avoid accusations of outright murder, but no more. Do nothing to encourage the new Duchess to recover. Do nothing to make her feel welcome. Treat her like what she was, a temporary affliction. The house itself seemed to be in on the conspiracy. The wind howled in the chimney, a mournful, constant cry. Rain lashed against the window pane. At night, the old timbers groaned and settled, sounding like footsteps in the hall, like whispers just outside the door. It was a house that was used to being empty, a house that resented the intrusion of a living, breathing person. It was trying to push her out, to squeeze the very breath from her lungs. One morning, after a particularly bad night spent in a fever-soaked delirium, Ilara woke to a sliver of weak, gray light filtering through the grimy window. She lay on her back, her body aching, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She stared up at the ceiling. A large, spreading water stain marred the plaster, its shape like a distorted map of some unknown, forgotten continent. She had been tracing its borders with her eyes for days. A map of hopelessness, a chart of her own decline. And in that moment, something shifted. A tiny, hard kernel of defiance, long buried under layers of politeness and resignation, suddenly ignited. It was a spark of white-hot clarity in the fog of her illness. She was not a duchess. The title was a farce. She was not a wife. The man who had given her his name had looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture he was putting into storage. She was a prisoner, sentenced to a slow, quiet death in this damp-infested tomb. But she was not dead yet. The realization was not triumphant. It was cold, hard, and practical. To die here, in this bed, tended by resentful strangers, was to give them exactly what they wanted. It was to fulfill the role Alistair had assigned her. It was to be the quiet, convenient problem that simply went away. And her entire soul, every fiber of her being that had survived a lifetime of being a burden and an afterthought, rebelled. She would not die to make his life more convenient. With a surge of adrenaline that was pure, undiluted anger, she threw back the heavy, damp covers. Her legs, when she swung them over the side of the bed, were shockingly thin and trembled with weakness. The floor was ice-cold against the soles of her feet. For a moment, the room spun, and she had to grip the bedpost to keep from collapsing. But she held on. She drew a breath, which turned into a painful, rasping cough, but she did not get back in the bed. She was done being a dying woman. It was time to start being a living one. She pulled on a dressing gown, her fingers clumsy and stiff. She walked, unsteadily, to the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty and cold. She leaned against the doorframe, gathering her strength, and waited. Eventually, she heard the shuffling footsteps of Tilly, the young maid, coming with her morning tray of misery. Tilly stopped short when she saw Ilara standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, as if she had just seen a ghost. Alara's voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. But it held a new, unyielding authority. "Move my things," she said. Tilly just stared, the tray trembling in her hands. "Mom, Your Grace." "Move my things," Alara repeated, a little stronger this time. "To a room with a southern exposure. A room with a fireplace that draws. A room where the sun can get in." Now, it was the first order she had ever given in her life. It was not a request. It was a command, born not of privilege, but of the absolute necessity of survival. The maid, caught between her fear of Mrs. Croft and the strange, new power in this pale woman's eyes, simply nodded, turned, and fled. Alara remained leaning in the doorway, her body trembling with the effort. It was a small victory, a tiny rebellion, but it was a beginning. She had stopped waiting to die. She had started to fight back. The new room was a revelation. It was smaller than the first, its furniture simpler, but it faced south, and when the clouds occasionally broke, the pale winter sun streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The fire, in a smaller, more efficient grate, burned brightly, pushing back the damp and filling the room with a dry, blessed warmth. From her window, she could see not a stone wall, but a sweep of the wild, beautiful moor, its colors shifting from brown to purple to gold with the changing light. It was still a prison, but it was a prison with a view. This small act of defiance sent a ripple through the stagnant household. Mrs. Croft appeared, her face a thundercloud of disapproval. "Her Grace is not well enough to be moved," she declared, her voice stiff with insubordination. Alara, propped up in a chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, met the housekeeper's gaze. The warmth had already begun to loosen the tightness in her chest. "On the contrary, Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice still weak but steady. "I was not well enough to remain where I was. I find I am allergic to mildew and despair." The housekeeper's lips thinned into a bloodless line. It was a declaration of war. Alara knew she could not win a direct confrontation. She had no real authority, no allies. She had to be smarter. She had to change the very ground on which they fought. The house was the battlefield, and its currency was not titles or lineage, but practical, brutal reality. Her first strategic move was to demand the estate ledgers. Mrs. Croft resisted, claiming the Duke kept them under lock and key, that they were not for Alara to see. Alara did not argue. She simply waited, and every time the housekeeper entered the room, she repeated her request, her voice calm and maddeningly persistent. "I should like to see the ledgers, please, Mrs. Croft." After 3 days of this relentless, quiet pressure, the ledgers appeared. A stack of dusty, leather-bound books dropped onto a table with ill-disguised resentment. She spent the next week of her convalescence poring over them. It was a grim, infuriating education in neglect. The accounts were a disaster, a tangle of mismanagement, petty theft, and sheer incompetence. Bills for supplies that had clearly never arrived. Wages paid to non-existent staff. Repairs listed and charged for on parts of the house she could see from her own window were still crumbling. The estate was bleeding money, not from any grand vice, but from 1,000 tiny, weeping wounds. Mrs. Croft was not just a hostile jailer. She was a terrible manager, presiding over a slow, inexorable decay, her only skill being the siphoning off of just enough to keep her own position secure. Armed with this knowledge, Alara planned her campaign. She could not fire the housekeeper, but she could make her irrelevant. Her next command was more shocking than the first. Once she was strong enough to walk the halls, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the chill, she summoned Mrs. Croft and the estate's only other significant member of staff, a quiet, stooped groundsman named Finch. Finch was a man of the moor, weathered and taciturn. He had a face like a wind-bitten rock and hands that were permanently stained with earth. He looked at Alara with a cautious, neutral curiosity, unlike the housekeeper's open hostility. "As of today," Alara announced, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, cold entrance hall, "we are closing the west wing, and the state dining room, and the ballroom. and all of the guest suites on the second floor. Board them up. It is a waste of heat and effort to maintain rooms we do not use. Mrs. Croft was apoplectic. The Duke's mother's receiving rooms? The dining hall? We cannot. It is not proper. What is not proper, Elara countered, her voice sharp, is for the roof over the kitchens to leak while we preserve rooms that have not seen a guest in 30 years. We are no longer in the business of preserving memories, Mrs. Croft. We are in the business of surviving the winter. She turned to the groundsman. Mr. Finch, can you do it? Finch looked from the furious housekeeper to the pale, determined Duchess. He saw the crumbling plaster. He knew the leaking roof. He had been patching it himself for years with no resources. He saw the simple, brutal logic in her command. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Ah, Your Grace. I can." It was the first time anyone had addressed her with a scrap of genuine respect. It felt more valuable than the title itself. That was the beginning of the takeover. Elara abandoned the entire apparatus of aristocratic life. The useless drawing rooms were shuttered, their furniture covered in dust sheets. The decaying grandeur was sealed off, like a gangrenous limb being amputated to save the body. She consolidated their lives into a small, defensible corner of the vast house. The kitchens, her own small solar, and a handful of bedrooms for the staff. She found a small, forgotten cache of silver, not ducal plate, but incidental pieces, candelabra, and serving dishes, and made a decision that would have given Mrs. Croft an apoplexy had she known. She had Finch discreetly take them to the nearest town, a day's ride away, and sell them. Not for silks or luxuries, but for sacks of flour, tools, nails, glass for the broken kitchen windows, and seeds. Hardy, practical seeds. The ornamental gardens, a source of great pride for the long-dead previous Duchess, were her next target. They were a ruin of frozen rose bushes and weed-choked gravel paths. "Dig it up," she told Finch. Together, they turned the earth. It was backbreaking work. Elara, still weak, her hands soft and unaccustomed to labor, worked alongside him. She learned the ache in the back, the sting of blisters, the deep, satisfying feeling of plunging a spade into the cold, resistant soil. Her pale, soft hands became chapped, then calloused, stained with the dark, rich earth. The mud of Blackwood, which at first seemed a symbol of her misery, became the source of her salvation. They did not plant roses. They planted potatoes and kale and turnips and onions. They planted things that would grow, things that would feed them. The house began to change. Its center of gravity shifted from the cold, formal front rooms to the warm, bustling kitchens. The scent of mildew was slowly replaced by the scent of wood smoke, of baking bread, of simmering vegetable stew. Elara, discovering a small, neglected library of household management and herbalism, began to experiment. She found stores of dried rosemary, thyme, and lavender, and hung them for the kitchen beams, their fragrance mingling with the cooking smells. She brewed infusions for her own cough, remedies that were bitter and strange, but which worked, slowly strengthening her lungs. The staff's loyalty, which had been automatically granted to Mrs. Croft, began to shift. The two young maids, Tilly and another girl named Bess, saw this strange, quiet Duchess working harder than any of them. They saw her poring over ledgers by candlelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. They saw her out in the garden in the biting wind, her face smudged with dirt. She did not command them like a mistress. She directed them like a general, explaining the logic behind her orders. She was not preserving a dying world. She was building a new one, a world where warmth and food were more important than polished silver. They started coming to her with their problems, bypassing the furious Mrs. Croft entirely. Finch became her silent, loyal lieutenant. He understood her pragmatism. He respected her resilience. He saw that she loved the land not for its beauty, but for its utility, for its honest, brutal truth. He would appear at her side with a dead rabbit for the pot, or a suggestion for how to better insulate a window, and she would listen, and they would plan, a silent partnership forged in mud and necessity. Mrs. Croft became a ghost in their new, functional world. She would sweep through the kitchens, her expression venomous, but her authority was gone. She was a relic of an order that no longer existed. The house was no longer a tomb presided over by a dragon. It was a fortress. It was a farm. It was becoming a home. And Alara, the pale, dying bride, was its undisputed queen. Alistair returned in the dead of winter, 6 months after he had left. He did not return triumphant. He returned defeated, not by his political enemies, but by the very system he had mastered. A brutal session in Parliament, filled with betrayals and hollow victories, had left him feeling scoured out, empty. The endless machinations, the false smiles, the weight of 1,000 competing duties had finally worn him down to the bone. He felt nothing but a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. He did not come to Blackwood to see his wife. He was ashamed to admit, barely thought of her. He had received no black-edged letter, which meant she was, presumably, still alive, a fact he registered with the same faint annoyance as an unpaid bill. He came to Blackwood because it was the one place on earth he owned that was synonymous with silence and isolation. It was the end of the world, a place where no couriers would find him, where no petitioners would beg his favor. He was seeking the peace of the grave he had so callously assigned to her. He craved the cold, the damp, the quiet decay. He wanted to be left utterly alone. The journey north was a brutal slog through deepening snow. When his carriage, a sturdy, unadorned traveling coach this time, turned onto the familiar track to the manor, he braced himself for the final, depressing stage of decay he expected to find. He remembered the sucking mud, the boarded windows, the air of utter abandonment. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as he expected, was the gate. It was no longer a single, sagging barrier hanging from a broken hinge. It was 2 sturdy wooden gates, freshly repaired and rehung, barred against the snow. His driver had to get down and open them. Alistair stared, a flicker of irritation cutting through his exhaustion. Who had authorized this? As the carriage made its way up the drive, he noticed other things. The low-hanging branches of the skeletal trees had been trimmed back, creating a clear passage. The drive itself, though covered in snow, felt firmer, less treacherous. And then he saw the house. It was still the same grim, dark stone pile, but it was different. It was alive. Smoke, thick and white and smelling of good, dry wood, curled from 3 separate chimneys, not just the one miserable trickle he remembered. Light, warm, yellow, welcoming light, glowed in the windows of the entire eastern wing, windows that he was certain had been boarded over. The west wing was dark, a solid block of shadow, but the contrast only made the eastern half seem more vibrant. The house looked lopsided, asymmetrical, and awake. He felt a surge of profound annoyance. He had come here for a tomb, and someone had lit candles in it. His quiet, decaying sanctuary had been disturbed. The carriage stopped. He stepped out, not in a mud, but onto a courtyard that had been cleared of snow and laid with fresh gravel. The air did not smell of mildew. It smelled of wood smoke and, faintly, of something baking. He walked to the front door and lifted the heavy iron knocker, letting it fall with a resounding clang that seemed to echo his displeasure. The door was opened not by the grim-faced Mrs. Croft, but by the young maid, Tilly. Her eyes widened in shock, but not, he noted, in fear. She curtsied. "Your Grace, we were not expecting you." "Evidently," he said, his voice clipped. He strode into the entrance hall, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. The hall was freezing, colder even in the air outside. It was clean, but utterly Spartan. The grand staircase was roped off. The doors to the formal receiving rooms were shut, with visible draft excluders pushed against their bases. It was like walking into a museum that had been closed for the winter. "Where is everyone?" he demanded. "Why is the house shut up?" We live in the East Wing now, Your Grace," Tilly stammered. Her Grace's orders. To save on heat. Her Grace. The words hung in the cold air. He had almost forgotten he had Her Grace. He followed the girl, his boots echoing on the stone flags, through a series of corridors until they reached a door from which the light and warmth emanated. The smell of baking bread, he now realized, and something savory like roasting onions grew stronger. He heard the low murmur of voices. Tilly opened the door, and he stopped dead in the threshold. He was not in a drawing room. He was in the kitchens, a vast, stone flag space he had never set foot in his life. And it was the warmest, brightest, most alive place he had been in for months. A fire roared in a huge hearth. Copper pots, polished to a gleam, hung from the ceiling. Herbs were drying from the beams. And at the center of it all, at a massive, scrubbed wood table that served as the room's command center, sat his wife. She was not the pale, dying creature he remembered. Her face had a little color. Her hair, though simply pinned, shone in the firelight. She was wearing a practical dark wool dress, its sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was surrounded by papers, his ledgers, he realized with a jolt, and she was in the middle of a quiet but intense discussion with the groundsman, Finch, who stood beside her, respectfully holding a broken harness. She was not reclining on a chaise lounge. She was not wasting away in a sickbed. She was holding court, in the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, her eyes, those startlingly green eyes, widening for a fraction of a second before her expression settled into a mask of cool, unreadable composure. She looked magnificent. Her fragility was still there, a fine-boned delicacy to her features, but it was overlaid with something new, a core of steel. She was no longer a victim. She was a ruler in her own tiny, self-made kingdom. The room fell silent. The maids stopped their work. Finch straightened up, his expression unreadable. Alistair stood in the doorway, a dark, looming specter of a world that had no place here, his exhaustion and his anger warring within him. He was the Duke. This was his house, and he was an intruder. He spoke, and the words that came out were not a greeting. They were a blunt, stupid accusation, born of shock and a deep, unsettling confusion. "You're alive." Alara looked at him, her gaze clear and unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, no diffidence, only a faint, ironic amusement. She did not rise. She inclined her head, a gesture so slight it was almost an insult. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said, her voice as cool and crisp as the winter air. "We weren't expecting visitors." The rebuke was as sharp and clean as a slap. "We, not I. We, the people of this house, this functional world you have stumbled into, and visitors, not master, not husband, an unexpected guest, an outsider." Alistair felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He had come here seeking a void, and he had found a fortress with its queen firmly on the throne. And that throne, it seemed, was a stool at the kitchen table. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was master here. But as he looked around the room, he saw the truth. The cook, a stout woman he didn't recognize, looked not at him, but at Alara, waiting for a signal. Finch had shifted his stance slightly, placing himself subtly between the Duke and the Duchess. Tilly and Bess watched their mistress with expressions of fierce, unquestioning loyalty. He had the title. She had the power. "I will have a room prepared," he said, his voice tight with authority he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. "And dinner. In the dining hall." It was Alara who answered, not the staff. She gestured vaguely towards the cold, dark part of the house he had just come from. "The dining hall is closed for the winter, Your Grace, as are all the formal rooms. The silver is sold, the fires are out, and the staff is too small to service them." She said it not as an apology, but as a simple statement of fact. "Dinner is at 7. Here," she patted the scrubbed wood of the kitchen table. "You're welcome to join us. I believe there's mutton stew." It was not a suggestion. It was not an invitation. It was a decree. He, the Duke, had been relegated to the servants' table. He could either eat mutton stew in the kitchen with the staff, or he could starve in the freezing, magnificent tomb he had intended for her. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching. He saw the challenge in her eyes, the sheer, unyielding audacity of it. He, who could command ministers and bend the will of Parliament, was being told where he would eat in his own house by a woman he had bought for a pittance and left to die. A strange, unfamiliar emotion stirred in his chest. It was not anger. It was a grudging, infuriating flicker of respect. "Fine," he snapped, turning on his heel. 7. He strode from the room, not because he had won, but because it was the only way to retreat without surrendering completely. The sound of quiet activity resumed behind him, the life of the house closing in over the space he had occupied, leaving him alone again in the cold, dark hall. The days that followed were a cold war fought in a landscape of snow and silence. Alistair was given a room in the East Wing, a chamber that was clean, warm, but conspicuously Spartan. There were no valets, no footmen. His world of effortless privilege had evaporated. If he wanted hot water, he had to fetch it from the kitchens himself, an act so alien to him that he stood before the huge boiler for a full minute, unsure of the mechanics. The maids, polite but distant, followed Alara's orders, not his. They were her staff, not his. He was a ghost in this new version of Blackwood, a visitor who had overstayed his welcome. He wandered the cold, shuttered halls of the West Wing, the familiar territory of his past, and found them alien. The dust sheets on the furniture were like shrouds. The silence was not the peaceful emptiness he had craved, but the dead silence of a place that had been deliberately abandoned. The life of the house had been consolidated elsewhere, leaving this part to its decay. He had wanted a tomb, and she had given him one, while she carved out a vibrant, living kingdom for herself next door. He ate with them in the kitchen. Every night, he would take his seat at the head of the long wooden table, a position of honor that felt utterly absurd in this context. Alara sat at the opposite end, the clear center of authority. She directed the conversation, which was never about London or politics, but about the practical realities of their lives. The health of the single milk cow, the dwindling supply of firewood, Finch's progress on repairing the stable roof. They were discussions in which Alistair had no part to play, no knowledge to offer. He was an observer, a silent, brooding presence at a council of war where he did not know the language. He watched her. He watched the way she listened intently to Finch, her brow furrowed. He watched the easy, respectful way the maid spoke to her. He watched her check the quality of the bread, her hands, no longer pale and soft, but capable and work-worn, moving with purpose. She had taken the ruin he had given her and built a functioning, self-sufficient world. She had not merely survived. She had triumphed in the most practical, infuriating way imaginable. And he did not know what to do with her, or with himself. His own world of power and influence seemed abstract and meaningless here. What good was a ducal decree against a leaking roof? What use was a seat in the House of Lords when the immediate problem was a sick cow? He, who had always been defined by his power, felt utterly powerless. The tension between them was a constant, living thing. It was in the silence that fell when he entered the kitchen. It was in the careful, formal way she addressed him as Your Grace. It was in the way he found himself arguing with her over trivialities, the proper way to stack firewood, the necessity of selling off another fallow field, simply to assert his presence, to remind her and himself that this was his house. "You have sold the south pasture?" he demanded one evening, having discovered this fact from a stray comment by Finch. Without my permission, she did not even look up from the account book she was studying by the light of a single candle. It was lying fallow. The tenant farmer who has taken it on has a strong back and 2 healthy sons. He paid in coin, which we have used to purchase 2 pigs and enough winter feed to see the cow through to the spring. It seemed a prudent decision. It is my land. The decision was mine to make. She finally looked at him, her green eyes cool and direct in the candlelight. "You were not here, Your Grace." The cow, however, was, and she was hungry. "I made a choice between your theoretical authority and her actual survival. I chose the cow." There was no answer to that. He was left fuming in silence, defeated by the simple, irrefutable logic of a hungry animal. The breaking point, when it came, was not a shout but a howl. It began with the wind. A massive winter storm brewed in the dark heart of the north, descended upon the moors. It was not like the rain and wind that had been their constant companions. This was a different beast entirely. A screaming, violent entity that threw itself against the stone walls of Blackwood Manor with a physical, percussive force. Snow, driven horizontally, obliterated the landscape, turning the world outside the windows into a churning vortex of white. The house, which had felt like a fortress, suddenly seemed fragile. The wind shrieked in the chimneys, a high, keening wail that sounded like 1,000 tormented souls. The old timbers of the house groaned and shuddered. A shutter on one of the boarded-up windows in the west wing was torn from its hinges and began to slam against the wall with a rhythmic, maddening bang, bang, bang. For Alistair, the sound was a key turning a lock on a door he had kept sealed for a decade. The howling wind, the percussive, rhythmic banging. It was the siege of Badajoz, the endless, mind-numbing roar of the French cannons, the shudder of the earth under his feet, the screams of dying men. He had been a young man then, an officer, trapped in the blood and the noise and the terror. He had survived, but the sound had embedded itself deep in his memory, a piece of shrapnel in his soul. He was sitting in the kitchen, trying to read, but the words blurred on the page. The noise of the storm was not outside anymore. It was inside his head. He felt the familiar cold sweat on his brow, the tightening in his chest. The carefully constructed walls of the Duke of Blackwood, the cold, detached politician, began to crumble. He was back in a breach, the air thick with gunpowder and fear. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the stone floor. Alara looked up, her expression questioning. "Your Grace? Are you unwell?" He did not answer. He could not. He strode out of the kitchen, away from the warmth and the light, and retreated into the cold, dark halls of the west wing, drawn to the rhythmic banging of the shutter like a moth to a destructive flame. He needed the cold. He needed the dark. He needed to be alone with his ghosts. At the same time, the storm was launching its own assault on Alara. The relentless, penetrating damp, driven by the furious wind, found its way through every tiny crack in the stone. The temperature in the house plummeted. After months of careful management, of building up her strength in the dry warmth of her solar, the sudden, aggressive chill was a shock to her system. She felt the old, familiar tightness in her chest. A dry, tickling cough started, a ghost of her former illness. She ignored it. There was too much to do. The storm was a direct threat to her small kingdom. She moved through the house, checking on the staff, ensuring the animals in the small, attached bar were safe, directing Finch and the maids as they stuffed sacks under doors and checked window latches. She was fueled by adrenaline and a fierce, protective instinct. This was her home, her fortress. She would not let the storm defeat it. But with every gust of wind, the cough worsened. It became a deeper, rasping sound that she tried to stifle, turning her head away so the others wouldn't see. Her head began to ache, and a familiar, dreaded heat began to build behind her eyes. The banging of the loose shutter was a maddening, constant assault. It was a weakness in their defenses. "I'll see to it," Finch said, but Alara shook her head. "No, you're needed here to reinforce the door to the buyer. I can manage it. I just need to get a rope around it." It was a foolish, prideful decision, born of overwork and the first flush of fever. She grabbed a coil of rope and her heaviest cloak and plunged into the frigid, echoing halls of the West Wing, heading toward the source of the noise. She found the Duke there, standing in the middle of a vast, empty ballroom, staring at nothing, his face a pale, sweat-sheen mask. He didn't seem to see her. He was utterly lost, a man drowning in plain sight. She hesitated, a flicker of concern piercing her own growing distress. But the shutter slammed again, a violent crack of sound, and her purpose reasserted itself. She found the window. The wind tore through the broken pane, a physical blow of icy air. She fought her way toward it, her cloak whipping around her. She leaned out into the screaming vortex, fumbling with the rope, trying to lash the wildly swinging shutter. A wave of dizziness, hot and sickening, washed over her. The world tilted. Her lungs seized, and a violent, racking cough tore through her, stealing her breath, her strength, everything. Her grip on the window frame loosened. The roar of the wind became a distant hum. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the swirling snow, and the last thing she felt was the cold stone of the windowsill against her cheek as she collapsed. Finch found her. He had come looking, worried by her long absence. He found her a crumpled heap on the floor beneath the broken window, snow dusting her hair, her face as white as the blizzard outside. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her, his heart pounding with a grim terror. He carried her out of the cold, dead wing and back towards the light. He burst into the kitchen, shouting for help. Alistair, who had eventually been drawn back from his dark trance by the sheer animal instinct for warmth, was there. He was standing by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his face still pale and haunted. He turned as Finch entered, and he saw her. He saw her limp form in the groundsman's arms. He saw her closed eyes, the blue tint to her lips. He saw the utter stillness of the woman who had been a whirlwind of infuriating, magnificent life. In that instant, the siege of Badajoz, the political betrayals, the crushing weight of his duties, it all vanished. It was burned away by a single bolt of pure, unadulterated terror. It was a feeling so sharp and so primal it took his breath away. The detached Duke, the cold pragmatist, the weary politician, that man ceased to exist. In his place was only a man, terrified of losing something he had not even known he possessed. "Give her to me," he commanded, his voice a raw rasp. He stepped forward and took her from Finch's arms. The feel of her, so light, so cold, so fragile, was a physical blow. He carried her through to her room, the small, warm solar that she had made her own, and laid her gently on the bed. The maids fluttered around, wringing their hands, their faces pale with panic. "Get out," he snarled, his voice cracking with an authority born not of rank, but of sheer, desperate fear. "All of you, get out." They fled. He was left alone with her in the room, the storm still raging outside, a pale reflection of the tempest in his own chest. He looked down at her still, white face, and the world narrowed to this single, terrible point. He had sent her here to die, and she had refused. Now, it seemed, she might obey his original command after all, and the thought was so unbearable it felt like a physical wound. A switch flipped in his brain. The part of him that was a commander, a man who took charge in a crisis, took over. He was no longer the haunted Duke. He was a man with a mission, and that mission was to keep her breathing. He worked with a clumsy, frantic energy. He was a man used to having things done for him, but here there was no one else. He piled logs on the fire until it roared, the heat so intense it was almost unbearable. He stripped off her wet cloak and dress with an impersonal efficiency, his hands shaking slightly, and wrapped her in warm, dry blankets. He found the herbal remedies she had made for herself, the bitter-smelling infusions, and, lifting her head, forced a few spoonfuls between her pale lips. For 2 days and 2 nights, he did not leave her side. He was a clumsy, desperate nurse. He bathed her face with cool water when the fever raged. He held her hand, a hand that felt small and bird-like in his own, when the coughing fits racked her body, whispering nonsensical words of encouragement. He forced broth, tea, and her own medicines into her, a spoonful at a time, his entire being focused on this one simple, monumental task. He saw, in a way he had never allowed himself to see before, the terrible fragility he had once dismissed as a mere inconvenience. He saw the sharp angle of her collarbones, the translucent thinness of her skin. But he also saw the fierce, stubborn strength that had allowed her to survive this long. He saw the account books still stacked neatly on her desk. He saw the worn, practical dress folded over a chair. He was tending not to a broken doll, but to a wounded warrior. And a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness rose in him, so powerful it was suffocating. In the dead of the second night, with the storm finally beginning to exhaust itself, he sat by her bed, watching the flicker of her breath on the blankets. He thought she was asleep. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. And in the silence, the walls he had built around himself for a lifetime finally crumbled to dust. He began to speak, his voice low and rough, the words meant only for himself and the still figure in the bed. "The noise," he whispered. "It was the guns. At Badajoz. They went on for days. You never knew when it would stop, or if it would. The world was just noise." And screaming, he paused, his own breath catching in his throat. "I was in charge of 100 men. Good men. I froze. Just for a moment. In the breach. A corporal, a boy from Sussex, he pushed me forward. He took the shot that was meant for me." He stopped, the confession hanging in the warm, still air. It was a secret he had carried for a decade, a shard of shame that had defined him. He had never spoken of it to another living soul. He spoke it now to her, to this woman who was not his wife, not his duchess, but something else entirely, something essential. He did not know that she was not fully asleep. Alara was drifting in a feverish, liminal state, a place between dream and waking. And through the fog, she heard him. She heard the words, but more than that, she heard the raw, naked pain beneath them. She heard the boy who had frozen in the breach, the man hidden beneath the cold, impenetrable armor of the Duke. And in that moment, in the depths of her own illness, she understood him. When the fever finally broke, it was dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The silence was absolute, profound. Alara opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was him. He was asleep in the chair by her bed, his head slumped forward onto his chest. His ducal facade was gone, stripped away by exhaustion. In sleep, he looked younger, his face unguarded, etched with lines of weariness and fear. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His cravat was undone, his clothes rumpled. He was not the Duke. He was just a man who had kept watch. She stirred, a faint rustle of blankets, and his eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot, but instantly alert. He stared at her, and she saw a flicker of raw, undisguised relief in their depths before it was quickly masked. "You're awake," he said. His voice was hoarse. "It would appear so," she whispered, her own voice weak and raspy. No thanks to a foolish argument, with a shudder. He did not smile. He simply nodded, then rose and walked, stiffly, from the room. He returned a few minutes later with a cup of tea. He had clearly made it himself. It was too strong. The milk had been slightly scorched, and there was a stray tea leaf floating on the surface. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. It was the most perfect cup of tea she had ever tasted. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. The war was over. An unspoken truce had been declared. The silence that fell between them now was not a weapon, but a shared space, a quiet territory they were beginning to explore. He did not retreat to the cold West Wing. He stayed. He would sit in the chair by her fire while she regained her strength, sometimes reading aloud to her from a book of poetry he had found, his low, resonant voice filling the small room. He, in turn, began to cede control. One afternoon, as she was propped up against her pillows, her mind clearer than it had been in days, she looked at the stack of ledgers on her desk. "Your Grace," she said, her voice still fragile, "would you be so good as to read me the latest figures from the winter store's ledger? I am concerned about the oats." It was a test, a question of whether he would retreat into his ducal pride or accept the new reality. He hesitated for a moment, then rose, walked to her desk, and picked up the ledger. He sat down and began to read, his voice stumbling slightly over her neat, precise figures. The Duke of Blackwood was taking dictation from his invalid wife. As she grew stronger, their partnership solidified. It was a partnership forged in practicality. She was the general, her mind sharp and strategic, directing the running of the house from her chair. He became her hands, her legs, her physical presence in the world. He, who had never performed a single act of manual labor in his life, found himself mending a broken chair under her precise instructions. He mucked out the cow stall because Finch was busy repairing the storm-damaged roof. He chopped firewood, his powerful shoulders finding a new, satisfying purpose in the rhythmic swing of the axe. He discovered a strange, grounding peace in the work. The problems here were real, tangible. A broken fence could be mended. A hungry animal could be fed. There was a simple, honest truth to it that was entirely absent from his life in London. The endless, shifting maze of politics was replaced by the straightforward reality of survival. He began to understand what she had built here. It was not just a home. It was a system, a living organism, and he was slowly, cautiously finding his place within it. One afternoon, he came into her solar, his hands grimy, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He had been helping Finch reset a stone in the courtyard wall. She was at her desk, a blanket over her knees, working on the accounts. She looked up and smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It transformed her face, erasing the last traces of the pale, haunted woman he had first met. "You look ridiculous," she said, her voice laced with a gentle amusement. "The wall is mended," he replied, a corresponding smile touching his own lips. It was in that moment that he realized he was happy. Not triumphant, not powerful, not satisfied. Just happy. A quiet, steady contentment that felt more real and more valuable than any victory he had ever won in Parliament. He was no longer a duke seeking a tomb. He was a man who had, against all odds, found a home. The thaw came slowly, tentatively. The world of white began to recede, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The air, while still cold, held a new, faint promise of spring. Life at Blackwood had settled into a new rhythm, a quiet, productive partnership between the two of them. The staff, seeing the Duke chopping wood and taking orders from a duchess, had accepted the new reality with a quiet pragmatism that mirrored their mistress's own. Mrs. Croft, utterly defeated, had packed her bags and departed one morning without a word, a silent admission that her world was gone forever. They had built something here in the heart of the winter, a fortress against the world, a functioning, self-sufficient household, a partnership, something more. And then the old world came calling. It arrived in the form of a royal courier, a splash of garish official red against the muted gray and brown of the landscape. He rode a lathered horse, a man in a hurry, a messenger from a life Alistair had almost forgotten. He carried an urgent dispatch, sealed with the king's own crest. Alara saw him first from her window. She was standing, watching Finch begin the spring plowing of the kitchen garden. When she saw the courier, the splash of red against the mud, her face, which had grown softer, more open in recent weeks, instantly shuddered. The mask of cool, formal composure dropped back into place. Her back straightened. Her walls, which had been so carefully, tentatively dismantled, went back up, higher and more impregnable than ever. Of course, she had been a fool to think it would last. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His life was in London. His duties were to the crown, to politics, to the great grinding machine of the world. She and her tiny, muddy kingdom were a diversion, a winter project, a convalescence. Now he was recovered, and the world had come to reclaim him. Alistair met the courier in the courtyard. He took the sealed dispatch, his expression unreadable. Alara watched from the doorway of the kitchen, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was readying herself for the blow, for the second and final abandonment. She had survived the first. She was not sure she could survive this one. He broke the seal and read the document. His face remained a blank mask. The king's summons was unequivocal. A crisis in the cabinet. His presence was not requested. It was demanded. His particular skills in negotiation and ruthless enforcement were required. It was the world he had mastered, the world that had almost destroyed him. He finished reading, folded the paper, and stood for a long moment, looking not at the courier, but at the dark, rich earth of the courtyard. He looked at the smoke curling from the kitchen chimney. He looked at the repaired stable roof. He looked at the woman standing in the doorway, her face pale, her expression guarded, bracing herself to be left behind once more. He walked past the waiting courier. He walked into the kitchen, the heart of the house, the center of the world she had built. The fire was burning brightly. A pot of soup was simmering on the hearth. The room smelled of warmth and life and home. Alara watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She performed a small, stiff curtsy, a gesture of formal distance, of preparing for the end. "Your Grace," she said, her voice brittle. "I will have your things packed at once." He stopped in front of her. He looked at the dispatch in his hand, then at the fire, and with a single decisive movement, he dropped the king's summons into the flames. The parchment blackened, curled, and was consumed, the royal seal melting into a meaningless blob of wax. The courier, who had followed him to the door, gasped. Alara stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. Alistair turned to her. The firelight flickered on his face, burning away the last vestiges of the cold, remote Duke. All she saw was the man who had sat by her bed, the man who had confessed his fears in the dark, the man who had learned to find peace in the swing of an axe. "My duties are here now," he said, his voice low and resonant, a sound that vibrated through the floor, through the very stones of the house. He took a step closer, closing the small, formal distance she had tried to put between them. "Blackwood is my only concern." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently, tentatively, touched her cheek. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a declaration of absolute, undeniable truth. "You are my home." And with those words, the last of her defenses, the fortress she had built around her heart for a lifetime, shattered into 1,000 pieces. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a path through the faint dusting of flour that still lingered on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It was a flag of surrender. She took a single, halting step toward him, and then another. She leaned forward and rested her head against the solid, steady wall of his chest. She could feel the strong, even beat of his heart under her ear, a rhythm that was as real and as grounding as the earth beneath her feet. He wrapped his arms around her. It was not a passionate embrace, not the embrace of a storybook romance. It was something far deeper, far more profound. It was an anchor. It was a homecoming. He held her with a sense of permanence, of finality, as if he were a man who had been wandering for a lifetime and had, at last, arrived. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures who had found their center in each other. They stood together in the warmth of the kitchen they had saved, the smell of wood smoke and life all around them. Outside, the last of the winter snows melted away, and the moor was beginning to show the first faint blush of green. A new season had begun. The house, and the two people who were its heart, were fiercely alive and completely whole. They would not dine without each other again.